She was left in the dust until the sheriff took in the wild girl with a knife and no name. The ghost in the dust. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a town that had seen better days when the railroad still ran through it. Sheriff Colton Hayes adjusted his worn leather hat as he stepped out of his office, the familiar creak of the wooden porch beneath his boots, a sound that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. At 42, he carried the weight of too many hard decisions in the lines around his eyes and the slight stoop to his shoulders. The town was stirring to life. Mrs. Henderson sweeping the front of her general store, old Pete hitching his mule to the water cart, and the usual cluster of men gathering outside Murphy's saloon despite the early hour. But something was different today. There was a tension in the air, whispers carried on the desert wind. "Sheriff," called out Tommy, the blacksmith's boy, his face flushed from running. "There's something down by the old water tower. Ma says it ain't natural." Colton's hand instinctively moved to his gun belt, fingers brushing the worn handle of his Colt 45. He'd learned long ago that in a town like Redemption Creek, ain't natural could mean anything from a rabid coyote to trouble with a capital T. The walk to the water tower took him past the remnants of what had once been the town's pride, a small church with a cracked bell tower, a schoolhouse that hadn't seen children in months, and rows of abandoned houses with broken windows that stared like hollow eyes. The desert had begun to reclaim what man had tried to build, and Colton sometimes wondered if he was fighting a losing battle, trying to keep civilization alive in this forgotten corner of Texas. As he approached the rusted water tower, he heard it, a low, almost feral growling that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. His hand moved to his gun, and he stepped carefully around the base of the tower, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. Crouched in the meager shade of the water tower was a figure that barely looked human. Matted dark hair hung in tangles around a face so dirt-streaked and sun-darkened that it was impossible to tell age or even gender at first glance. The person, for it was a person, Colton realized, was wearing the tattered remains of what might have once been a dress, now little more than rags hanging from a skeletal frame. But it was the knife that caught his attention. A rusted blade, probably salvaged from some long-abandoned homestead, clutched in hands that shook not from weakness but from barely contained rage. The growling was coming from this wild creature, and when their eyes met, Colton saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror years ago when he'd first arrived in Redemption Creek running from demons that still haunted his dreams. It was the look of someone who had been broken by the world and was determined not to let it happen again. "Easy there," Colton said softly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him well in countless dangerous situations. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The growling intensified, and the figure pressed further back against the water tower, the knife held out like a barrier between them and the world. Colton could see now that it was a young woman, probably no more than 20, though the desert and whatever hell she'd been through had aged her beyond her years. "I'm Sheriff Hayes," he continued, slowly removing his hat and setting it on the ground, a gesture of peace he'd learned from an old Apache tracker. "This is my town, and I'm not going to let anyone hurt you here." The woman's eyes darted between him and the hat, confusion flickering across her dirt-stained features. She hadn't expected kindness, that much was clear. Her grip on the knife loosened slightly, but she remained coiled like a spring, ready to strike or flee at the first sign of threat. "When's the last time you ate?" Colton asked, noting the way her clothes hung on her frame, the hollow look in her eyes. "Or had clean water?" At the mention of food and water, something shifted in her expression. The primal need for survival warred with her obvious distrust of human contact. She licked her cracked lips, and Colton caught a glimpse of just how young she really was beneath all that dirt and desperation. "I've got food back at the jail," he said, making no move to approach her. "And water, a place to rest where nobody can bother you." The woman's eyes narrowed and she shook her head violently, the knife wavering in her grip. Words seemed to be beyond her, but her meaning was clear. She trusted no one, expected nothing but pain from human contact. "I understand," Colton said, and meant it. "I've been where you are. Maybe not exactly, but I know what it's like to be running from something so bad you'd rather die in the desert than face it." Something in his tone must have gotten through to her, because the growling stopped. She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking straight through to his soul. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy something in her, because she slowly lowered the knife a few inches. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Colton continued, "but I am asking you to let me help. Just for today, just for one meal, and a safe place to sleep. After that, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." The woman glanced around the empty landscape, her eyes lingering on the buzzards circling overhead. She was smart enough to know that without help, she wouldn't last much longer in this heat. The desert was beautiful, but it was also merciless to those who couldn't provide for themselves. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a barely perceptible nod. It wasn't trust. It was the calculated decision of someone who had learned to weigh risks and benefits with the cold logic of survival. But it was enough. "All right then," Colton said, slowly picking up his hat and settling it back on his head. "The jail's about a quarter-mile back toward town. You can follow me or you can take your own path. Either way, the door will be open." As he started walking back toward Redemption Creek, he could hear the soft shuffle of bare feet in the dust behind him. She was following, but at a distance that would allow her to run if she needed to. Smart girl, he thought. Trust was a luxury neither of them had been able to afford for a long time. The townspeople who saw them coming stopped their conversations and stared. Some made the sign of the cross. Others backed away from the wild-looking young woman who walked like a predator even in her weakened state. Mrs. Henderson dropped her broom and hurried inside her store, slamming the door behind her. "Sheriff, what in the Sam Hill are you doing?" called out Murphy from his saloon porch. "That thing ain't human." Colton turned to face the crowd that had gathered, his expression hard as granite. "Her name is—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The weight of his reputation settled over the crowd like a blanket. Colton Hayes might be getting older, but he was still faster with a gun than anyone in 3 counties, and he'd proven more than once that he didn't make idle threats. As they reached the jail, Colton opened the door wide and stepped aside. The woman hesitated at the threshold, her entire body tense with the possibility of trap. But hunger and exhaustion finally won out over caution, and she stepped inside. The jail was simple but clean. A small office with a desk and 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and 2 cells in the back that hadn't held a prisoner in months. Colton went to the stove and began building a fire, his movements calm and deliberate. "There's a basin of water over there," he said without looking at her. "And soap if you want to wash up. I'll get some food going." The woman stood in the center of the room, still clutching her knife, still ready to bolt. But as the smell of bacon began to fill the small space, her stomach growled loudly enough that even she couldn't ignore it. "Go ahead," Colton said, stirring a pot of beans. "The water's clean and the soap won't hurt you. Door stays open if it makes you feel better." For the first time since he'd found her, the woman looked uncertain rather than hostile. She moved to the basin like a wild animal approaching a water hole, constantly checking over her shoulder. When she saw her reflection in the water, she froze, staring at the stranger looking back at her. Colton pretended not to watch as she began to wash, but he couldn't help but notice the way she flinched when the water touched certain parts of her body. Scars, he realized, old ones and new ones, telling a story he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. As the sun began to set outside the jail window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sheriff Colton Hayes found himself cooking for 2 for the first time in years. The woman had cleaned up as best she could and was now sitting in the corner, knife still in hand but no longer pointed at him. "Don't know your name," he said, ladling beans onto 2 plates. "Don't need to know it until you're ready to tell me, but I figure we ought to call you something." She looked up at him with eyes that were startlingly clear now that the dirt was gone. Green eyes, he noticed, the color of spring grass after a rain. "How about Grace?" he suggested. "Just for now until you want to tell me different." The woman, Grace, tilted her head like a curious bird. She mouthed the word silently, as if trying it on for size. After a moment, she gave another of those barely perceptible nods. As they ate in comfortable silence, Colton couldn't help but think about the last time he'd shared a meal with someone who understood what it meant to be truly alone in the world. It had been his wife, Mary, before the fever took her 5 years ago, before he'd retreated into himself and let the job become his only companion. Outside, the desert night was settling in, bringing with it the promise of cooler temperatures and the distant howl of coyotes. But inside the jail, for the first time in a long while, neither the sheriff nor his unexpected guest had to face the darkness alone. "You can take the cot in the back cell," Colton said when they'd finished eating. "Lock's broken, so you can come and go as you please. I'll be right here at the desk if you need anything." Grace stood up, clutching her knife, and looked toward the cell. For a moment, Colton thought she might refuse, might walk back out into the desert rather than accept even this small kindness. But then she nodded and walked toward the back of the jail. As she settled onto the narrow cot, knife tucked under the thin pillow, Colton turned down the lamp and settled into his chair. He'd meant to do some paperwork, catch up on reports that had been piling up for weeks. Instead, he found himself staring out the window at the stars, thinking about second chances and the strange ways fate brought people together. In the back cell, he could hear Grace shifting restlessly, unused to the comfort of a real bed. But she stayed, and that was something. It was a start. The language of Silence Dawn came slowly to Redemption Creek, the sky lightening from black to deep purple to the pale gold that promised another scorching day. Sheriff Colton Hayes had been awake for an hour already. moving quietly around the jail so as not to wake his unexpected guest. He'd learned to be an early riser during his years in the cavalry, and the habit had served him well as a lawman. The smell of coffee filled the small space as he worked at the stove, preparing breakfast with the same methodical care he brought to everything else in his life. Bacon sizzled in the pan, and he'd managed to find some eggs that Mrs. Henderson had left on his doorstep, her way of apologizing for her reaction the day before, he supposed. A soft sound from the back cell made him pause. Grace was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with her knife across her knees, watching him with those startlingly green eyes. She'd slept in her clothes, such as they were, and her hair was still a tangled mess despite yesterday's washing. "Morning," Colton said quietly, as if speaking to a skittish horse. "Hope you slept some." Grace tilted her head, studying him with that intense gaze that seemed to see everything. She stood slowly, testing her legs, and Colton noticed she moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to be ready for anything at all times. "Breakfast is almost ready," he continued, keeping his voice calm and neutral. "There's more water in the basin if you want to wash up again." She approached the basin like she had the night before, constantly aware of his presence but no longer actively hostile. The morning light streaming through the window revealed more than the lamplight had. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 18 or 19, with delicate features that spoke of mixed heritage. Mexican and Anglo, perhaps, or maybe Apache. The desert Southwest was full of people whose bloodlines told the complex story of this harsh land. As she washed, Colton noticed her watching him in the reflection of the water, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity. He was a puzzle to her, this man who'd offered help without asking for anything in return. In her world, such kindness must have been rare enough to be suspect. "I've been thinking," Colton said as he plated the food, "about what you might need. Clothes, for one thing. Mrs. Henderson's daughter passed a few years back, but she kept some of her things. Might fit you." Grace turned from the basin, her expression unreadable. She looked down at her tattered dress, then back at him. After a moment, she nodded. They ate in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence than the night before. Yesterday it had been the silence of two wary predators sharing the same territory. Today it felt more like the companionable quiet of people who understood that not everything needed to be said aloud. When they finished eating, Colton stood and reached for his hat. "I need to make my rounds, check on the town. You can come with me if you want, or you can stay here. Either way is fine." Grace looked toward the door, then back at him. The idea of being alone in the jail seemed to appeal to her more than facing the stares and whispers of the townspeople. "Door locks from the inside," Colton said, understanding her choice. "Nobody can get in unless you let them. I'll be back in a couple hours." As he stepped out into the morning heat, Colton could feel Grace watching him from the window. The townspeople were already starting their day, and he could see the curiosity in their faces as they noticed him leaving alone. "Sheriff Hayes," called out Dr. Morrison, the town's physician and one of the few people Colton genuinely respected. "A word, if you please." Colton walked over to where the older man stood outside his office, a small building that served as both clinic and pharmacy for the scattered residents of the area. "That young woman," Dr. Morrison said without preamble. "She's been through something terrible, hasn't she?" "Most likely," Colton agreed. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've seen cases like hers before. The way she moves, the way she holds herself. She's been hurt, Colton. Badly. And not just physically." Colton felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the cold, controlled fury that had made him dangerous in his younger days. "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying she's going to need time to heal, maybe a lot of time. And she's going to need someone who understands that trust isn't something she can just give away." "I know that," Colton said quietly. Dr. Morrison studied his face for a long moment. "Yes, I believe you do. Just be careful, Colton, for both your sakes. People in this town are already talking." The rest of his rounds were routine, checking on the few businesses that were still operating, making sure the water supply was secure, dealing with a minor dispute between two ranchers over grazing rights. But throughout the morning, Colton found his thoughts returning to Grace alone in the jail with her knife and her secrets. When he returned, he found her exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the window and watching the street. She'd braided her hair while he was gone, and the simple change made her look even younger, more vulnerable. "Everything quiet?" he asked, and she nodded. Colton went to a chest in the corner and pulled out a bundle of clothing. "These belonged to Doc Morrison's daughter. She was about your size, I think." Grace took the clothes with something approaching reverence, running her fingers over the clean fabric. A simple blue dress, undergarments, and a pair of worn but serviceable boots. It was probably the finest clothing she'd touched in months, maybe years. "You can change in the back cell," Colton said. "I'll be outside on the porch. When she emerged 15 minutes later, the transformation was remarkable. Clean clothes and braided hair revealed a young woman of surprising beauty, but it was more than that. She stood differently, as if remembering what it felt like to be a person rather than a wild thing just trying to survive. "Better?" Colton asked, and she nodded, smoothing the fabric of the dress with obvious pleasure. They fell into an easy routine over the next few days. Grace would wake before dawn, moving silently around the jail as if afraid to disturb the peace. Colton would make breakfast, and they would eat together in comfortable silence. During the day, she would stay in the jail while he made his rounds, and in the evenings they would share simple meals and sit on the porch, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Grace never spoke, but she communicated in other ways. A nod when she wanted something, a shake of her head when she didn't. She would point to objects she was curious about, and Colton would tell her what they were called, as if she were learning a new language, which in a way she was, the language of civilization, of human kindness, of trust, slowly earned. On the third day, Colton noticed her watching him clean his gun, her eyes following his movements with professional interest. When he finished, she pointed to the weapon, then to herself. "You know guns?" he asked. She nodded, then made a motion with her hands that clearly mimicked firing a rifle. Colton went to the gun cabinet and pulled out an old Winchester, checking to make sure it was unloaded before handing it to her. Grace took the rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who'd grown up around firearms. She checked the action, sighted down the barrel, and nodded approvingly at its condition. Then she handed it back with a look that clearly said she understood the trust he'd shown her. "You're full of surprises," Colton said, returning the rifle to its place. "Someone taught you well." For the first time since he'd found her, Grace's expression grew sad. She touched her chest, then gestured outward, a motion that seemed to encompass the vast emptiness of the desert. Someone she'd loved was out there, Colton realized. Someone who'd taught her to shoot, to survive, to be strong. Someone who wasn't coming back. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Colton found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about his time in the cavalry, about the battles he'd fought and the friends he'd lost, about coming to Redemption Creek to start over, about meeting Mary and losing her too soon. Grace listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. She might not speak, but she was a good listener, and Colton found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. "The thing about losing someone," he said, his voice soft in the desert night, "is that you start to think it's safer not to care about anyone else, easier to just exist. Do your job, keep your head down, don't let anyone get too close." Grace turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. There was something in her expression that made him think she understood exactly what he meant. "But existing isn't really living," he continued. "I forgot that for a while. Maybe I'm just now remembering." She reached out then, a tentative gesture that made him freeze. Her hand touched his arm just briefly, but it was the first time she'd initiated physical contact with another human being since he'd found her. The touch was light as a butterfly's wing, but it carried the weight of everything she couldn't say. "Thank you," that touch said, "for the food, for the shelter, for the safety, for treating me like a person when everyone else saw only a wild thing, for giving me time to remember who I used to be." "You're welcome," Colton said quietly, understanding perfectly despite the lack of words. As the night deepened around them, both the sheriff and the young woman he'd chosen to protect sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Neither of them spoke of the future, of what would happen when the past came calling, as it inevitably would in a place like the desert, where secrets had a way of surfacing like bones in the sand. But for now, in this moment, they had found something precious, a fragile peace built on mutual understanding and the slow, careful construction of trust. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new tests of the bond they were building. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, they were no longer alone, shadows from the past. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, when the heat was already shimmering off the desert floor like visible malice. Sheriff Colton Hayes was cleaning his gun on the porch of the jail when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. Too big to be a single rider, too purposeful to be a dust devil. Grace saw it too. She'd been sitting on the porch steps, mending a tear in her dress with thread Mrs. Henderson had grudgingly provided. The moment she spotted the approaching riders, every line of her body went tense as a bowstring. The needle fell from her fingers as she stood, her hand instinctively moving to the knife she still wore at her hip. "Grace," Colton said quietly, not looking away from the dust cloud. "You know who that might be?" She didn't answer. She never did with words, but the way she backed toward the jail door told him everything he needed to know. Her face had gone pale beneath the tan the desert sun had given her, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Easy," Colton said, standing slowly and holstering his gun. "Whatever's coming, we'll handle it together." The riders resolved themselves into 4 men on horseback, leading a pack animal loaded with supplies. They rode with the loose, easy posture of men who'd spent most of their lives in the saddle, but there was something in their bearing that set Colton's teeth on edge. They moved like predators, and they were heading straight for Redemption Creek. "Get inside," Colton said to Grace, his voice carrying the quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Lock the door and stay away from the windows." For once, Grace didn't hesitate. She disappeared into the jail, and Colton heard the heavy bars slide into place behind the door. Whatever history these men represented, it was nothing good. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, lean and weathered like old leather, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile. His clothes were dusty from travel but well made, and the gun on his hip was clean and well maintained. A professional, Colton thought grimly. "Sheriff Hayes?" the man called out as he reined in his horse about 20 feet away. "Name's Jeremiah Kane. I'm looking for something that belongs to me." Colton stepped off the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Kane, what brings you to Redemption Creek?" Kane's eyes swept over the jail, the town, and came back to rest on Colton with calculating interest. "Heard you might be harboring a runaway. Young woman, dark hair, about this tall." He held up his hand to indicate Grace's height. "Goes by the name of Elena." "Elena," Colton repeated, tasting the name. It fit her better than Grace, he realized. "What's your interest in this woman?" "She's my property," Kane said simply, as if that explained everything. "Bought and paid for. I've come to collect what's mine." The words hit Colton like a physical blow. He'd suspected Grace, Elena, had been running from something terrible, but the casual way Kane spoke of owning another human being made his blood run cold. "Well now," Colton said, his voice deceptively calm. "That's interesting. See, slavery was abolished some time ago, Mr. Kane. Last I checked, one person can't own another." Kane's smile was thin and humorless. "Oh, Sheriff, you're thinking too narrowly. There are many kinds of ownership, many kinds of contracts. Elena signed herself over to me willingly, didn't you, girl?" The last words were directed at the jail, and Colton saw one of the window shutters move slightly. Elena was listening, and from the way Kane's smile widened, he'd seen it too. "Even if that were true," Colton said, "which I doubt, a person can't sign away their freedom. Not legally, not morally. But you see, Sheriff, Elena isn't just anyone. She's special, aren't you, girl?" Kane's voice carried a note of menace that made Colton's hand tighten on his gun. "She has skills that make her very valuable to the right people, skills that took considerable time and effort to develop." Behind Kane, the other three riders had spread out slightly, their hands resting on their weapons. They were expecting trouble, Colton realized. They'd come prepared for a fight. "Skills," Colton repeated. "What kind of skills?" Kane's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "The kind that make problems disappear, Sheriff. The kind that make people disappear. Elena is very good at what she does, or was before she got sentimental and ran off." The pieces clicked into place in Colton's mind with sickening clarity. Elena's familiarity with weapons, her feral wariness, the way she moved like a predator even when weakened by hunger and exposure. She'd been trained as a killer, molded into a weapon by the man who now claimed to own her. "I see," Colton said quietly, "and you want her back." "I want what's mine," Kane corrected. "Elena cost me a considerable investment, training, feeding, housing. She owes me a debt that can only be paid in service. What if she doesn't want to go with you?" Kane's expression hardened. "What she wants is irrelevant. She's a tool, Sheriff, a very expensive tool that I intend to reclaim. Over my dead body," Colton said, and meant it. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, the only sound was the desert wind whistling through the empty buildings of Redemption Creek. Then Kane smiled again, and it was worse than his frown. "That can be arranged," he said pleasantly, "but I'd prefer to keep this civilized. I have a legal document signed and witnessed that gives me the right to reclaim my property. I'm willing to compensate you for any trouble you've been put to." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, holding it out to Colton. The sheriff made no move to take it. "Keep your paper," Colton said. "The woman stays." "Sheriff Hayes," Kane said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that was somehow more threatening than his earlier menace. "I don't think you understand the situation. Elena is a killer, a trained assassin. She's murdered more people than you've arrested, I'd wager. Are you really willing to risk your life and the lives of your townspeople to protect someone like that?" From inside the jail came the sound of something falling, and Colton knew Elena was listening to every word, learning, perhaps for the first time, how others saw her, what others thought she was. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Colton said firmly. "Even killers, especially killers." Kane studied him for a long moment. "You're a fool, Sheriff, but you're also in my way. I'll give you 1 hour to reconsider. After that," he shrugged eloquently. "After that," Colton prompted, "after that I'll take what's mine, and anyone who stands in my way will be treated as an enemy. Elena knows what that means, don't you, girl? The shutter moved again and Colton caught a glimpse of green eyes bright with unshed tears. Whatever Kane's threats meant, Elena understood them all too well. 1 hour, Kane repeated, turning his horse. Think carefully, Sheriff. Elena isn't worth dying for. As the 4 riders headed toward the saloon, Colton remained on the porch, his mind racing. He was outgunned and outmanned, and he had no doubt that Kane and his men were every bit as dangerous as they appeared. But he'd made his choice the moment he'd found Elena by the water tower, and he wasn't about to change it now. The sound of the door opening behind him made him turn. Elena stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She held her knife in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. Paper from his desk, he realized, with words written in careful letters. I should go, the paper said, to protect you, to protect the town. Colton took the paper, read it twice, then looked into her eyes. Is that what you want? Elena shook her head violently, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She wrote quickly on the back of the paper, I want to stay, but I'm afraid. Of Kane? She nodded, then wrote again, of what I am, what I've done. Colton set the paper aside and gently took her shoulders, careful not to startle her. Listen to me, Elena. I don't care what you were before. I don't care what they made you do. All I care about is who you choose to be now. She looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her, Colton saw hope warring with despair. You saved me, she wrote on a fresh piece of paper. Now I'll save you. We'll save each other, Colton corrected. That's what people do when they care about each other. Elena stared at him for a long moment, then wrote one more word. How? Colton smiled grimly. The same way I've handled every other problem that's come to my town. We face it head on, and we don't back down. As they stood there on the porch, the heat of the desert sun beating down on them, both the sheriff and the young woman he'd chosen to protect knew that the next hour would change everything. The past had finally caught up with them, and there would be no more running, no more hiding. But for the first time in her life, Elena wouldn't have to face her demons alone. And for the first time in years, Colton Hayes had something worth fighting for besides duty and the fading memory of justice. The showdown was coming, and they would meet it together. The weight of truth. The interior of the jail felt smaller, with tension crackling in the air like summer lightning. Elena sat at Colton's desk, her hands moving quickly across paper as she wrote, crossed out and wrote again. The words came slowly, painfully, as if each letter was being torn from some deep place inside her. Colton watched her struggle, his heart aching for the pain he could see in every line of her body. Outside, the sun was climbing toward its zenith, and their hour was slipping away like sand through fingers. Elena, he said gently, you don't have to tell me everything, not if it hurts too much. She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, and shook her head. Then she pushed the paper toward him, her hand trembling slightly. My name is Elena Vasquez, he read aloud. I was 15 when they took me. My family had a small ranch outside El Paso. Papa raised horses, good ones. Mama grew vegetables and kept chickens. I had a little brother, Miguel. He was 8. Colton's hands tightened on the paper. He'd seen enough of the world to know where this story was headed, and he already dreaded the rest. Kane came one night with his men. They said Papa owed them money, that he'd borrowed from the wrong people. Papa said he'd never borrowed anything, but they didn't listen. They killed him first, then Miguel when he tried to run. Mama, Elena's writing became shaky here, the letters uneven. Mama begged them to let me go. She said she'd do anything. They laughed and shot her too. Colton set the paper down, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Elena, you don't have to. She held up her hand, stopping him, and wrote more. I should have died with them, but Kane saw something in me. He said I was too valuable to waste. He said I had potential. He made me watch them burn the ranch, burn my family, then he took me. The next page was harder to read, her handwriting becoming more erratic as she relived the memories. For 3 years they trained me, taught me to fight, to kill, to become a weapon. They said I was paying off my family's debt with my service. They said I belonged to them now. The weight of truth continued. Colton's hands shook as he read the next page, his anger building like a storm on the horizon. Elena's story poured out in careful script, each word a testament to horrors no one should have to endure. They broke me down first, the writing continued, locked me in a cellar for weeks with barely any food or water. When I finally stopped screaming, stopped begging, they started building me back up, but not as Elena Vasquez, as something else, something that could kill without question. The paper was stained with tears now, both hers and his. I was good at it, too good. They said I was their finest creation. For 2 years I did things, terrible things. I told myself I was surviving, that I was honoring my family's memory by staying alive, but I was just a coward. I was just afraid to die. Colton looked up at Elena, who was staring out the window at the dusty street. Her shoulders were rigid with remembered pain, and he could see the way her hand kept moving unconsciously to her knife. What changed? He asked softly. Elena wrote without looking at him. There was a job, a family outside San Antonio. Kane said the man had cheated him in a business deal, said they all had to pay. But when I got there, the man had children, a little girl with dark hair like I used to have. She couldn't have been more than 7. The writing stopped for a long moment, and Colton could see Elena's internal struggle playing out across her face. I couldn't do it, she finally wrote. I stood there with my gun drawn, and I couldn't pull the trigger. For the first time in years, I remembered my brother's face. I remembered what it felt like to be innocent. So you ran, Colton said. Elena nodded, then wrote more. I told them I'd completed the job, but I let the family escape first. When Kane found out, he was furious. He said I'd forgotten my place, forgotten who owned me. He said he'd have to remind me. The next words were written so hard they nearly tore through the paper. He said he'd make me watch him kill that little girl's family slowly, one by one, until I remembered what disobedience cost. Colton's vision went red around the edges. He'd killed men before in the war and in his years as a sheriff, but it had always been in defense of himself or others. Looking at Elena's story, he found himself wanting to kill Jeremiah Kane for the simple pleasure of watching him die. That's when I knew I had to run, Elena wrote. Not just from that job, but from everything. From him, from what I'd become. I've been running for almost a year now, living like an animal because I thought that's what I deserved. She looked up at him then, her green eyes filled with a pain so deep it made his chest ache. I'm not good, Sheriff. I'm not worth saving. I've killed innocent people. I've done things that can never be forgiven. Colton set the papers aside and moved to kneel in front of her chair. Elena, look at me. She met his gaze reluctantly, as if she expected to see disgust or fear there. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch. Acceptance, understanding, and a fierce protectiveness that reminded her of her father. You were a child, he said firmly. A child who was tortured and brainwashed by monsters. What they made you do doesn't define who you are. Elena shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She wrote quickly, You don't understand. I was good at it. I liked it sometimes. The power, the control. What does that make me? Human, Colton said simply. It makes you human, Elena. You think you're the only person who's ever found satisfaction in being good at something, even something terrible? You think soldiers don't sometimes enjoy the rush of battle? You think lawmen don't sometimes take pleasure in bringing down the worst criminals? He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where a few townspeople were hurrying about their business, trying to pretend they hadn't noticed the dangerous strangers in their midst. The difference, he continued, is that you chose to stop. When it mattered most, when you were faced with killing an innocent child, you chose to be Elena Vasquez instead of Kane's weapon. That's what defines you. Elena wrote again, her hand steadier now. But what if I can't stay Elena? What if the thing they made me is stronger? Colton turned back to her, and the look in his eyes was harder than desert stone. Then I'll help you remember who you really are, as many times as it takes. The sound of boots on the porch made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. Colton's hand moved instinctively to his gun as a knock came at the door. Sheriff Hayes, Kane's voice called out. Your hour is up. Colton looked at Elena, who had gone pale but whose jaw was set with determination. She wrote one last line on the paper. I won't let them hurt you, and I won't let them take you, Colton replied. He walked to the door but didn't open it. Mr. Kane, I believe I made my position clear. The lady stays. Kane's laugh was cold and mirthless. Sheriff, I really hoped you'd see reason. Now I'm afraid this is going to get unpleasant. It was already unpleasant, Colton called back. The moment you rode into my town talking about owning people. Elena, Kane's voice shifted, becoming almost gentle. I know you're in there, child. I know you're listening. Come out now, and the sheriff won't have to suffer for your selfishness. Elena stood from the chair, her knife in her hand, and walked toward the door. For a moment, Colton thought she might actually open it, might sacrifice herself to save him and the town. But instead, she pressed her back against the door and wrote on the wall with a piece of charcoal, No. Elena, Kane called again, you know what I'm capable of. You know what I'll do to anyone who stands between us. Come out now, or I'll burn this whole town to the ground to get to you. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Colton knew Kane meant every word. He'd seen men like him before, men who saw other people as tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. There would be no reasoning with him, no compromise. Elena, Colton said quietly, I need you to get away from the door. Go to the back window and be ready to run if things go bad. She shook her head and wrote quickly, I run, you die, I stay. We fight together. This isn't your fight, Colton said. Elena's smile was sad but determined. She wrote one more line. Yes, it is. For the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that matters. Outside, they could hear Kane talking to his men, though the words were too low to make out. Whatever they were planning, it wouldn't be good. Colton checked his guns, counted his ammunition, and tried to calculate their chances. 4 against 2, and Elena was still recovering from her ordeal in the desert. The odds weren't good, but they weren't impossible either. "Elena," he said, "can you still shoot?" She nodded and pointed to the rifle cabinet. Colton unlocked it and handed her the Winchester, along with a box of ammunition. She checked the weapon with professional efficiency, and for a moment he saw a glimpse of the deadly weapon Kane had created. But when she looked at him, her eyes were Elena's, determined, frightened, but fundamentally good. "Whatever happens," Colton said, "remember that you're not alone anymore. We face this together." Elena nodded and wrote one final message, pressing it into his hand. "Thank you for seeing me, the real me." Outside, the voices stopped, and an ominous silence fell over Redemption Creek. Colton and Elena took their positions, weapons ready, hearts pounding with the terrible knowledge that the next few minutes would determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone in town. The showdown was about to begin, and there would be no going back. Fire and steel. The first shot came through the window without warning, spiderwebbing the glass and sending shards across the jail floor. Colton and Elena dove for cover behind the heavy wooden desk as more bullets followed, punching holes in the walls and filling the air with splinters and dust. "Stay down," Colton shouted over the gunfire, but Elena was already moving, crawling toward the side window with her rifle. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, all her training coming back despite the months of trying to forget. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving their ears ringing in the sudden silence. Colton risked a look over the desk and saw Kane's men spreading out, taking positions behind the water trough, the old hitching post, and the corner of Murphy's saloon. "Elena," Kane's voice called out, "this is your last chance. Come out now, or I start burning buildings with people inside." To emphasize his point, one of his men produced a torch and held it meaningfully toward the general store, where Mrs. Henderson and her customers were undoubtedly cowering behind the counter. Elena's face went white, but her grip on the rifle never wavered. She looked at Colton and pointed to herself, then to the back door. Her meaning was clear. She wanted to circle around behind them. "Too dangerous," Colton whispered, but Elena was already shaking her head. She grabbed a piece of paper and wrote quickly, "I know how they think, how they move. Trust me." Before Colton could stop her, Elena was sliding toward the back of the jail, keeping low and moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to hunt human prey. She paused at the back door, looked back at him once and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Then she was gone, disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings behind the jail like a ghost. Colton turned his attention back to the men in the street. Kane stood in the center, his arms crossed, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a train. The torch-bearing man was still threatening the general store, while the other two had taken up positions that would let them pour fire into the jail from multiple angles. "Sheriff Hayes," Kane called out, "you've got about 30 seconds before my man there lights up Mrs. Henderson's store. After that, it's the saloon, then the church, then any other building that looks like it might have people in it." Colton felt the familiar cold anger settle over him, the same emotion that had carried him through battles in the war and confrontations with outlaws too numerous to count. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't just fighting for duty or justice. He was fighting for Elena, for the woman she was becoming, for the life she deserved to have. "You want her so bad?" Colton called back. "Come and get her yourself, Kane. Stop hiding behind your men." Kane's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Oh, Sheriff, I'm not hiding. I'm just enjoying the show. You see, Elena was always at her best when she was protecting someone. It brought out her creative side." The words were barely out of his mouth when the man threatening the general store suddenly stiffened, his torch falling from nerveless fingers. He took a step forward, then collapsed face first into the dirt, a knife handle protruding from between his shoulder blades. Elena emerged from the shadows beside the store like an avenging angel, her movements fluid and deadly. She retrieved her knife with a quick, efficient motion and disappeared again before the other men could bring their guns to bear. "Impressive," Kane said, his voice carrying a note of professional appreciation. "She hasn't lost her touch." But Colton could see the tension in Kane's shoulders, the way his hand moved unconsciously to his gun. Elena's attack had been perfectly executed, but more than that, it had been exactly the kind of move he'd trained her to make. She was using his own lessons against him. Another of Kane's men cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his arm where Elena's knife had found its mark. She was toying with them now, Colton realized, using their own tactics against them. Hit and run, stay mobile, keep them guessing. "Elena," Kane shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Show yourself. Face me like the warrior I trained you to be." The response came from an unexpected direction, the church bell tower. Elena had somehow made her way up there, and now she had a perfect view of the entire street. Her rifle spoke once, precisely, and the third man went down with a bullet through his leg. "You want to face me?" Elena's voice rang out across the town, and Colton felt his heart stop. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and her voice was clear and strong and beautiful. "Then face me alone. Let the sheriff and the town go." "You know I can't do that," Kane called back. "You're mine, Elena. You belong to me." "No," Elena said, and there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I belong to myself, and I choose to stay here, with people who see me as more than a weapon." Kane's face twisted with rage. "You're nothing without me. I made you. I gave you purpose." "You gave me nightmares," Elena replied. "Sheriff Hayes gave me hope." The words hit Colton like a physical blow. In all his years as a lawman, he'd never heard anything more beautiful or more terrifying. Elena was choosing to fight not just for her freedom, but for the life she'd found in Redemption Creek. "Enough," Kane snarled. He drew his gun and fired at the bell tower, his shots chipping stone and sending dust cascading down. "If you won't come down, I'll come up." But as he started toward the church, Colton stepped out of the jail, his own gun drawn. "Your fight is with me, Kane. I'm the one who offered her sanctuary." Kane turned to face him, and for a moment the two men simply stared at each other across the dusty street. The sun was directly overhead now, casting short shadows and making the air shimmer with heat. "You're a fool, Sheriff," Kane said. "She's a killer. She'll always be a killer. What makes you think she won't turn on you eventually?" "Because I've seen who she really is," Colton replied. "Underneath all the training, all the pain you put her through, she's still Elena Vasquez. She's still the girl who couldn't kill an innocent child." "That girl is dead," Kane spat. "I killed her myself." "No," Colton said quietly. "You just buried her. But she's been digging her way out ever since." Kane's gun came up fast, but Colton was faster. His bullet took Kane in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The older man stumbled but didn't fall, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You think you've won?" Kane gasped. "There are others who know what Elena is, what she's capable of. They'll come for her eventually. Then they'll have to go through me," Colton said simply. Elena's voice came from the bell tower again, softer now. "Sheriff, Colton, is it over?" Colton looked around at the fallen men, at Kane clutching his wounded shoulder, at the townspeople beginning to emerge from their hiding places. The immediate threat was over, but Elena was right. This was just the beginning. "For now," he called back. "Come down, Elena. Come home." As Elena climbed down from the bell tower, Colton kept his gun trained on Kane. The man who had stolen a child's innocence and twisted her into a weapon was defeated, but the damage he'd done would take time to heal. "This isn't over," Kane said through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what you're protecting." "I know exactly what I'm protecting," Colton replied. "A young woman who deserves a chance at a real life." Elena appeared at his side, her rifle still ready but her face soft with something that might have been hope. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked truly free. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colton looked at her, at the town, at the vast desert that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Now we start over, all of us." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the first one heard in Redemption Creek in months. Perhaps it was a sign, Colton thought. Perhaps the town was ready to live again, and perhaps with Elena by his side, he was ready to live again too. Epilogue. New beginnings. 6 months later, Redemption Creek was a different place. The train had started running again, bringing new settlers and commerce to the forgotten town. Buildings that had stood empty for years now housed families, businesses, and the sound of children's laughter. Elena had found her voice in more ways than one. She spoke regularly now, her words careful and considered but growing more confident each day. She'd also found her place in the community, helping Dr. Morrison with his patients and teaching the older children how to shoot, a skill that was still necessary in this harsh land, but one she now passed on with emphasis on protection rather than predation. The scars of her past would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She was Elena Vasquez again, but also something more, a woman who had chosen to use her dark skills for light purposes, who had found redemption in the most unlikely place. Colton watched her from the porch of the jail, now expanded to include a small apartment where she lived. She was in the garden behind the building, tending to the vegetables she'd planted with the same careful attention she'd once given to weapons. Her movements were still graceful, still predatory when necessary, but now they were also gentle, nurturing. "Sheriff?" Tommy, the blacksmith's boy, appeared at his elbow. "There's a telegram for you." Colton took the message and read it quickly. His expression darkened as he absorbed the words. "Bad news?" Elena asked, appearing beside him with the silent grace that was still part of her nature. "Maybe," Colton said. "There's been word about some of Kane's associates." They're asking questions about what happened here. Elena's face went still, but she didn't reach for her knife. That was progress, Colton thought. 6 months ago, any mention of her past would have sent her into a defensive crouch. Let them come, she said quietly. I'm not running anymore. Colton corrected. We're not running anymore. Elena smiled, a real smile that transformed her face and made her look like the young woman she'd never had the chance to be. She agreed. As the sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sheriff Colton Hayes and Elena Vasquez stood together on the porch of the jail that had become their home. Behind them, the town buzzed with life and possibility. Ahead of them, the future stretched out like an unwritten story. There would be challenges ahead. There always were in a place where civilization met the wild, but they would face them together, the sheriff and the woman who had learned that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, one that was always worth taking. The ghost in the dust had found her way home at last.